Welcome to FO Live. I'm Atul Singh, the founder, CEO, and editor-in-chief of Fair Observer. With me is Peter Isaacson, our Chief Strategy Officer, and Haruko Sato, our advisor. So we are in 3 different parts of the world. Today, I'm in New York. Peter Isaacson is in France, La Grande Nation, and Haruko Sato is in Osaka, Japan. And today we'll be discussing the American election, and we'll be looking at the American election through international eyes, because after all, I'm Indian, Peter is American who's turned French, and Haruko is Japanese, but studied in the US. Welcome, both of you, to this discussion. And to kick it off, question to you, Haruko. I know you don't really care much for personalities, but what does this election mean for the Japanese, or what does it signify um, uh, from your political, social, economic, cultural, analytical point of view?
I think, as in many countries, there's a great degree of anxiety, particularly because this is Trump 2.0. And so people
Trump
have
2.2. It'll be
well,
wonderful. It'll
so
make
it'll
America
be,
great again.
so there are some expectations that he would be difficult, transactional, and unpredictable. And I think unpredictable might be the key word, which is giving the Japanese some anxiety, partly because compared to 4 years ago, Japan has also gone through, if not dramatic change, quite a bit of political drama, having gone through, now 3 prime ministers since, or 4 prime ministers since the death of Abe Shinzo. But so I think from a Japanese perspective, I think there's more to be shared with others. It's nothing particularly sort of Japanese about how do we look at or how do we anticipate the next Trump administration. But one thing that's very different, and I noticed because, as you know, we also had a snap election. And as Atul just said, that we have a minority government. The Liberal Democratic Party was punished for the sort of the money scandals and other things. Perhaps the LDP fatigue, that nothing was really getting better. But recently it seems to be that people are more concerned about a lot of domestic issues. Yes, the big sort of security challenges are there, but domestic issues, I think, really are the priority. The
And
economy, the
to
yen.
focus the mind just very quickly, one hears even in Japan, where things are better than many other parts of the world, particularly the US, the cost of living crisis is acute.
Yes.
Would that be fair?
Yes, it's acute because of the, first of all, the energy prices. This has been so since the war in Ukraine, but also with the weakening yen, or shall I say the unstable yen, when yen ceased to be the go-to haven currency. That's really sort of put a lot of pressure on the government to subsidize or introduce economic policies that would mitigate the impact. So that's very much slightly different from, say, even 4 or 5 years ago. So
Got it.
Trump, yeah, but,
So from your point of view, Japanese are anxious about a new transactional Trump administration that might be more unpredictable. And of course, the Japanese like stability. So from the Japanese point of view, it's the unpredictability that is the worry.
yes. But wouldn't you say it's the same everywhere?
No, no, no. I'll tell you more about India and some other parts of the world later, but
Okay,
oh, over to
the
Peter.
allies, the allies.
The Allies, yeah. Over to Peter now to expound the view in France.
Okay, yes. In France, I think it's slightly different for a number of reasons. Europe is very different from Japan, culturally, politically, and historically. It's very different in the sense that,
You were on the winning side of World War II.
well, yes, yeah, some of us were. It was a divided nation as well during World War II. But
Yes, some of the French loved the Germans.
yeah, well, they lost that love after the war, and they were very proud to be considered the victors in the war. But now what I'm wanted to say about the complexity of the situation is that we have a war going on in Europe. Japan isn't yet involved. In fact, in a certain sense, I guess what's happening in Europe and in the Middle East has prevented the kind of confrontation that some people are predicting for Asia. So Japan can wait for that once the other questions are resolved in one way or another. But Europe is in a state of uncertainty that's aggravated by the fact that they know Trump and know how unpredictable he is, so they can predict his unpredictability. So it's a double problem. It's too predictable and it's too unpredictable at the same time. And the further complexity is that anyone who's trying to reason about anything in Europe, I'm speaking about political people first, but then we'll talk about the citizens, is aware that they have a double identity. They have their national identity, and then they have the European identity. And the European identity has always been a difficult one because it's kind of an emergent identity that started emerging after the Second World War. And once the first initiatives were taken to move towards a common market and then a European Union, that identity has been evolving with considerable difficulty and uncertainty. Nevertheless, Europe became a legitimate economic rival to the US during the period of unipolarity after the fall of the Soviet Union. So Europe had a lot of reasons to believe in itself, but the nations of Europe have never been united in believing in Europe, as we saw with Brexit. And so we're in a very complex situation where we have governments that have inherited a situation that was created after the Second World War, in which the US and the US institutions, more or less created by the US, dominated the way Europe could behave and the European countries. And that created a sense of dependence and I would say an ambiguous identity as the West. And that's what we're seeing now as things have been moving in other parts of the world. And I'm thinking of BRICS, for example, or just the rise of China. It has forced Europeans to think of themselves, to try to think of themselves differently, and we haven't yet succeeded. So now we've got this new problem, and here I'm speaking again of the politicians. The problem is, who are they in relation to the US? Who are they, and which US are they talking about? Because the dominant theme up to today has been there is the stable US, which is the two traditional parties, Democrat and Republican. It didn't matter who the personalities were, but those were parties that you could count on to behave in a certain way, and they were the masters of the universe we belong to. But Trump obviously unsettled that in 2016 because he didn't really represent his party. And it wasn't clear what he did represent. But what did become apparent to all Europeans was that the US was divided into, I wouldn't even say two camps, but we know that there's the great cultural wars that have dominated the way Americans interact with each other. So this has created a lot of confusion for Europeans who continue to see the US as the essential and necessary leader, but they don't know who they're being led by.
Very interesting. So the Europeans are confused themselves, and now they are confused about America in a nutshell.
Yes, and then and with the war in Ukraine, they're confused about
Exactly.
what Europe
Exactly.
is.
So now the view from India is interesting. Depends on who you talk to, because India has 1.4 billion people, and there are many political parties. So if you talk to people in South Delhi and South Mumbai, um, the people who go to posh schools and American undergrad, do their degrees in schools like Harvard or Yale or Mount Holyoke even, they are gutted. They're absolutely gutted. They've been reading the New York Times editorials. They think it's the end of the world, the death of the firstborn and bubonic plague. And if America falls, what hope for India? But I spoke to many people in the BJP, and there was absolute jubilation because there is no love lost between the ruling Bharatiya Janata Party and the Democrats. In fact, the Indian government was convinced that the Democrats were planning regime change. They are convinced that in Bangladesh, Sheikh Hasina felt because of American intervention, Americans plotted her downfall, engineered protests, funded the dissidents, and they thought in India, the opposition has sympathy from the left establishment in the US, which permeates through the media, through the foundations, through the universities, and into the Democratic Party. Now, Kamala Harris's grandfather was a man who served in the legendary Indian Administrative Service, the colonial service which India inherited from the Brits. The British had the Indian Civil Service, and we just changed the name. We replaced civil with administrative, which means that under the socialism that Jawaharlal Nehru brought, they became even more powerful. So the IAS is in some ways even more powerful than the IAS. And her grandfather was apparently quite a decent IAS officer, elite of the elite of the elite, who served in Africa and helped them develop, helped the newly independent African countries develop. But this puts her immediately as a suspicious president who has an ideological vendetta against the BJP. Now, Ro Khanna, who's a congressman in the House of Representatives, is reviled not just by the BJP, but a lot of people in center-right as Judas. He lied about his grandfather opposing the emergency, the period when Indira Gandhi threw the entire opposition and the entire press and anyone she didn't like into jail from 1975 to 77. And his grandfather actually supported instead of opposed it. He got into a Twitter storm. So suffice to say that the ideological divides within the US are mirrored within India. Culture wars within the US are mirrored within India. So the right in India wants Trump. The left in India wants the Democrats. And the right is in the majority and has been in the majority, at least in electoral majority, if not complete majority, since 2014. The other thing to remember is that the recent brouhaha about Indian attempts to assassinate and assassinate separatists, terrorists, as India calls them, in North America has upset the apple cart, or the diplomatic apple cart. India believes that it has been unfairly targeted. Canada and the US believe that India has been guilty of bad behavior. In any case, one of the complaints India has against Canada is valid, that Canada takes in too many dodgy elements. Often they will be criminals in India, if not terrorists, and Canada itself will reject their application. And then if they keep applying, they'll get application. They'll get citizenship. And then suddenly, just as you get money laundering, you get greenwashing, when suddenly people become ESG friendly, environment, social, and governance friendly, companies become ESG friendly. So do these Indians, once they get Canadian citizenship, then Indian law doesn't apply. And go back to the 80s when terrorists literally blew up Indian planes, one of which exploded in Tokyo, Haruko. And Canada refused, or rather, Canada never prosecuted the terrorists properly, and later admitted in a parliamentary inquiry that the inquiry had been shot. And you add two and two together, and India and Canada have visceral relations, particularly under Justin Trudeau, who's viewed as part of the left liberal conspiracy. So in India, particularly on the part of the government, there is absolute jubilation that the Democrats have gone. The Democrats are largely seen as anti-India, are seen as preachy, moralizing, holier than thou, sanctimonious scoundrels. And India is probably the only country other than Israel, which I can talk about at great length, because the Israelis are rather pleased, or at least Bibi Netanyahu's government is rather pleased that the Biden administration is gone. So it depends, ça dépend, as the French would say, the reaction in India, or the reaction in many other parts of the world. It's not the reaction that you have in France and Japan.
Well, I think it's not so different in that sense that, of course, how the world feels about the Democrats. So traditionally speaking, in the past pattern, at least in the past 40 years, Japan has always preferred a Republican government, Republican president. Because, as you say, the Democrats are preachy, holier than thou. And I distinctly remember when I was in graduate school and I was in Bologna, and it was the first Clinton administration, and they were negotiating the China's trading status as the most favored status, whatever it was. But one of
most favored nation, I think, MFN.
Yeah, most favored nations. Yeah. So anyway, the bone was human rights, and they were complaining about China's human rights records, blah blah. And this is really coming off, just a few years ago, Tiananmen and so on. But I do remember having actually quite a heated argument with my American students, friends, about why America insists on bringing out this human rights issue, drag it in the open, just so that you can humiliate and, make China lose face. This pattern hasn't changed. And
but my theory is that my theory is that Americans have to, and this is deeply embedded in the American psyche now, and I think Freud would have had fun with it, but Americans want to believe that they are the models of the application of human rights.
I understand that. I do understand that.
But they want to believe that because they know that they committed a genocide.
Yes, I think
they had slavery for half of their history. So
no. I think the point is, it is not. It's okay to believe. Everybody believes in something, And as you know, but the point about it is that Americans, and particularly under Democrats, they like to do this sort of name and shaming
Yeah,
in a diplomatic forum where, you know, it's almost like demonizing. And
yes.
this is back in 1993 or something, and I just felt like if this is the way that America is going to engage with a traditional Asian, proud Asian power, then they're never going to communicate with the Chinese right. And I'm not saying that because, I fear China or anything. It's just that the mode of communication here, particularly in East Asia or even Southeast Asia, so it's just different. And there is no attempt to learn the 200 years of American engagement with Asia, and they've never learned any manners or respect for. So I think I was just sort of saying that this, in a way, as I said, but it's more prevalent with the Democrats when they are sort of in office and they're executing their sort of America's global strategy. And it just happens, as Atul says, preachy, holier than thou. And
Well, to be fair, I was quoting I was
no,
quoting
no, no,
the
but
perception.
no,
Yeah.
this is, and but I think with the point is that this is not the usual Republicans anymore. So this is where we have to start the conversation about then what do we do? Do we go
Yeah.
and try to seek a semblance of balance or rebalancing or trying to sort of maintain and keep what can be kept, or completely change also our way of engaging so that we just sort of discard the previous sort of Democrat Republican dichotomy and just say, okay, we just have to think of a different way. We can't, as Peter said, it's predictably unpredictable,
Yeah.
meaning that we could pretty much drop all the Republican whatever hopes that Japan used to have about wishing for a Republican president. So anyway,
So,
I'm
so
a
it's
little, I'm a little surprised by the fact that we can still talk about Republicans and Democrats as if they were some kind of stable
yeah,
yin and
exactly.
yang.
Yeah. Well,
so
yes,
hold
that
fire,
needs.
Peter, hold fire, hold fire. From an Indian perspective, there's still a difference. So look at the two Republican ambassadors I know, one of whom has appeared on our YouTube channel, Robert Blake. When he was in India, he was wildly popular. I also met Kenneth Juster, who was actually a Trump appointee, and he was also suitably polite. And if you meet the new president, what's his name, Eric Garcetti in India, I'm sure he's polite, but he's far more tone deaf. He's far more preachy. He organized uh,
Democrat.
an iftar party for the Kashmiris. And that is like an Indian ambassador inviting Texan separatists over for Thanksgiving. And there is this persistent lack of understanding that you have country traumatized by partition, which would go to war again over Kashmir, that has fought certainly three wars, uh, arguably four if you include the Kargil War, and a counterinsurgency for decades. And there's no sensitivity at all on the part of Eric towards India. I don't think he studied a single uh, fat book of Indian history or slim book of Indian philosophy before coming over. So he talks to his Indian friends and his American friends who probably went to Harvard and Yale. He's a Rhodes Scholar, but Oxford clearly didn't have much of an effect on him. He didn't learn from the old imperialists. If nothing else, he would have acquired a sleeping dictionary like Lord Ochterlony, who had many Indian mistresses or probably wives. He's culturally completely illiterate. And this is not to say that Bob Blake and Ken Juster are, Samos of India, but they understand India, or they behaved in a much better way when they were in India. Primarily, perhaps, because they took a more geopolitically strategic point of view. They didn't go around believing that India had to turn into America. So even now, when it comes to foreign policy, there will be a difference. And you will see that difference, particularly when it comes to Russia, Ukraine, where Donald Trump is most likely going to make a deal. You'll see the difference in Israel, where Bibi Netanyahu will have a window to beat up everyone he wants before Trump says, stop it all so that I can focus on booming the economy and making Elon Musk rich. And there will be deals with India. There will be transactions with India, because India is a largely transactional country now. So depending on which part of the world we are talking about, there isn't that much of trepidation. And remember, before we forget, that the Abraham Accords came during Trump's time. And so from an Israeli point of view, he was quite all right with not just Israelis doing whatever they wanted, but also moving their capital to Jerusalem. So all in all, I think in a fragmented world, you get fragmented views like a kaleidoscope, or rather you get a kaleidoscopic view of America post this election.
But I think that's true the world over now. Everything's become fragmented. We've seen that in practically every election, the incumbents have been around the world. And this is the year of
in none of the developed countries, the incumbents have survived. And part of it is perhaps because of food inflation. So the Russia-Ukraine war has played a role in unseating lots of politicians from power.
Yes, absolutely. Well, because it has, as you say, it's destabilized the economy. People don't realize exactly where the connections are, but they see what the effects are. And the question I would ask is, around the world, to what extent can people, to what extent have people given up assuming that the US will be a stable country, whether it's the leader of the world or not? It's still the most powerful economy. And isn't that the kind of thing that influences the way people vote in elections and the reason they turn out the incumbents? But if you're turning out the incumbents, do you know who you're electing? And I would say that the US itself is an example of this, that it's turned out the incumbents in two cases. First, it was the Obama administration incumbents to put Trump in place. What happened in 2020 was also turning out an incumbent when Trump himself was an incumbent. And now they've brought the exiled incumbent back into incumbency. Is this kind of trend towards destabilization of or discontinuity in the political order something that's happening everywhere in the world? And does that have some kind of meaning that we need to interpret? Does it mean that something can emerge somewhere? And some people will say BRICS is an example of what might emerge. Not that BRICS itself will be the model, but that kind of trend towards grouping of interests that are not based on the old ideologies, or in fact, not based on any ideology, but rather interests
So
But
Peter, I'll cut you there. I think I see where you're going with it. I mean, look, BRICS is very simple. BRICS is an insurance against the US weaponizing the economic system.
yeah,
Because from the point of view of people I know in Brazil, in South Africa, in India, in Russia, um, so have I covered everyone? Brazil, Russia, India, China, and China. Uh, they want to be able to trade with each other. They don't want sanctions, and they want to get the cheapest deal or the cheapest price. So they are figuring a way around the use of the dollar. They are figuring a way around the use of Western financial institutions. And I think talk of BRICS coming up with a new alternative currency, etc., is overrated, but they can certainly come up with a more sophisticated form of barter. And they can have some electronic settlement of barter. All right, you're Russia, you need, and they used to do that during the days of the Soviet Union. You're Russia, you need, say, they don't need much, let's say, in terms of commodities, but you need, say, T-shirts, or you need leather shoes, and India sends you leather shoes and T-shirts, and China sends you machine tools and cheaper semiconductors, and you can settle the trade. Maybe you price it still equivalently in dollars, but no dollars are exchanged. You send X amount of say, T-shirts for Y amount of oil, or you send X amount of um, semiconductor chips for Y amount of technology that military technology that Russia transfers. So there it's a form of unionizing
yeah,
against Western dominance. Now, look, the interests
neutralize.
of mutualizing. So the interests of all these countries are still tied up with the US, because the US is in many ways a big market for India, the biggest market. And the last thing Indian businesses want is an implosion in the US economy. And they are addicted to the dollar. They want the dollar more than they want the rupee. They study in American schools or Americanized schools. They send their children, if they are rich, to undergrad degrees in America. And even if they are not rich, if they are bright after IIT, where you've taught, I've taught, the Indian Institutes of Technology, they come to America for their PhD. America is the template for American culture. After all, what is Bollywood but rip off of Hollywood movies? Throw in a few song and dance sequences and Indian actresses in white t-shirt wet scenes, and you have Bollywood. Lots more, garish music um, and
I,
pelvic thrusts, and that's it. But the reality is that, having said all of that, the Indian government and other governments want to have that option, that they are not circumscribed. So they've become more transactional, and therefore they've got together with this BRICS gathering.
yeah. No, I didn't want to put BRICS up as a model or a prediction that it would be the dominant system. What I'm saying is that there's, as the perception of a kind of endemic instability in the US, which everyone was quite content to have in a position of moral leadership or political or economic leadership or some combination of them, through exactly the things you're talking about, soft power, really. What we're seeing is a weakening of the effect of US soft power. And that's where
Peter, I'll interrupt you. It's not just soft power. So I was in Tokyo and I met a number of extraordinary people there, including Haruko Sato's father, Yukio-san, and so many people talked about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership is a very tangible example of something that took over a decade to negotiate, something that all of Asia bought into. And then suddenly Trump got elected and threw it out of the window. So rather than talking in generalities, this is the specific example where the uncertainty and unpredictability and variability of US action is affecting its soft power, its hard power, and fundamentally its reliability. Remember, let's not forget not just the Paris Climate Accords, but the Kyoto um, climate treaty. So there is a declining trust in America, and Trump accelerates that trend. Now, if you're India, then you're delighted because India wants to do transactional deals. If you're Israel, you're delighted with the new America. If you are Viktor Orban in Hungary, you're delighted. If you nurse a sense of justice of interacting with the US in the rules-based order, then you are absolutely delighted that now the mask is off. But a lot of other countries, a lot of allies who genuinely believed in the rules, who were goody two-shoes, like Germany and Japan, then you suffer.
I
Yes,
think there are two things about this particular phase of this conversation, which I thought was interesting, because the disruption in American domestic politics and how destabilizing it is and what that would impact, I think that phase is already started like 8 years ago with the election of Donald Trump. So the problem is that and therefore that's why in some ways people are not fearing just Trump, but how this election result really, really brings out, in stark contrast, the division within American society. So I think that's a given. I don't think it's just that how, for example, some people talk about, oh, it's going to be civil war and so on and so forth. But that aside, tangible things about Donald Trump that I think really, really hurts the most is his TPP is one, but as you say, the climate sort of sustainability issues are perhaps the ones that are really going to be hurt. And whether this is not just about the
Haruko,
climate.
don't you know that global warming is a myth?
No,
It is just
okay, so
Jesus
that's what I'm
testing your
saying.
faith.
that's Donald
That's what I'm
Trump.
saying. I don't care. There are climate deniers, but the point is, this is not some conspiracy theory hoax. And there are certain things that need to be done. And America pulling out, if they pull out again, it's in the amount of CO2 emissions, okay, it could be sort of mitigated and so on and so forth. But the point about it is that America has time and time and time again over the past, say, 10, 8, particularly 8 years, really become unreliable. And at the same time, some US policies, not because everybody understands where it comes from or how it is implemented, but there are a lot of people, and particularly young generation people, who are sort of becoming very anti-American. And this is not, I'm not talking about, Chinese propaganda saying, America's evil, so on and so forth. But there's a deep-seated sort of, well, we can't trust the Americans in a way that I don't think we've seen in the past, particularly in the post-1945 world, particularly in the free world. America isn't the shining sort of beacon of democracy. It is not equal opportunity. So, the strength of America is that it opens up everything, warts and all. So the social divides, racism, everything, everybody sees it. And I have to tell my Chinese students that, you might laugh at democracy being ineffective or inefficient, but America is able to come back from a lot of ugly domestic disagreements, somehow progress to another phase of, say, civic agreements, social code change, so on and so forth. But at the moment, this is wearing out. And I think that is more of a problem rather than the actual policy sort of tangible implications. It's really just that if you want to talk about soft power, America's soft power is probably in Amazon, Google, Apple, but not in anything that comes out of Washington, D.C.
Yeah. If I can come back to Europe for a second, then this puts what you're saying in perspective. In Europe, the sentiment was, first of all, surprise when Trump was elected in 2016, but everyone considered that to be a fluke, and there was a good reason to think it was a fluke because he didn't win the popular vote. People were aware of the curious electoral system in the States, which could allow something that you would not consider democratically normal to happen. So Europeans took the attitude that, okay, something strange has happened because of the way the system was built in the 18th century, but that's just a temporary problem. And they experienced it as a problem when they saw the Iran deal being canceled, the Paris Accords, and all the bizarreries of Trump's behavior in many different circumstances. If I mean, everyone remembers that Biden came back saying, we're going to return the US to a normal state. And Europeans really latched onto that. I mean, it coincided with the way they were thinking about things, that there is a normal America. America's too powerful not to be normal. And so we allowed it to happen, or they allowed it to happen for 4 years. Now we're going to go back to something that's manageable. Most Europeans just a month ago, and I know the media in the States certainly reassured them by telling everyone publicly that now that Biden was out of the race and Kamala Harris was in, that there would be a real return to normal with people not too old and people interested in the stability of a system in charge. And then it was a shock, obviously, 10 days ago when Trump was elected. So this leaves the Europeans in a very confused state. As I was saying earlier, for their own internal reasons, they're confused. But this is even more confusing because they don't know how to align or how to conceive of their alignment with the US. And of course, the German government collapsed last week. And that was certainly related to the shock of Trump. So we're seeing shock waves going through Europe. Now, we don't even know today what European...
I mean, it did have to do partly with Trump because the chancellor wanted to fund Ukraine, and they have a hard break on the deficit they can have. Maybe that that hard break is a little silly because Germany has decent public finances, but hey ho, every country is a product of its history, and the finance minister didn't want to cross that deficit limit and wanted to have a much lower level of support for Ukraine. So the big question, for instance, after the war that's coming up a lot is that, all right, now will the Europeans have to fund more of the Russia-Ukraine war? Will the Europeans have to pony up more for defense, the 2% that NATO demands? so on and so forth. Now, one thing that, Peter, you have to bear in mind is that, yes, the Europeans were relieved when Donald Trump was gone, but Joe Biden continued with many of Trump's policies. Joe Biden continued with Trump's tariffs on China. Joe Biden continued with Trump's protectionism. Joe Biden brought in the Inflation Reduction Act, which was nothing but an industrial policy for the US. This was discriminatory against European companies precisely when the Russia-Ukraine war increased energy costs on them. German businessmen, German industrialists, and owners of the Mittelstand have told me personally that it was as if America had decided to kick Europe not when it was down on its knees, but when it was on its back. And when I mentioned this in Washington to members of the Biden administration, they shrugged and said, oh, but the Europeans practice protectionism. The Japanese practice protectionism. So, if we are doing this, it's nothing new. Oh, they'll just complain. So there was a smugness in the Biden team. Now, I'm not saying that the Trump team will be any better, but now the Trump team might just take that protectionism and turbocharge it. And if that happens for export-oriented economies, that could be bad news.
Yeah, what I wanted to say about Europe, everything you say is absolutely correct, is that I've been speaking about how the governments in Europe have reacted, and they are confused. They are unstable, and that includes the UK. But we don't know how European citizens are reacting because they've been kept in the dark. And they haven't, and as we've seen, they haven't even supported the incumbents when they had the choice to throw them out. But what they get in return or as a replacement is totally uncertain as well. What the real thing I wanted to mention is that because nobody has really informed the Europeans about what this is about, the media have been execrable in their ability to and that's why Fair Observer is so important. The media in Europe, I would say, in many ways, is worse than the media in the U.S. In its neglect of the real issues, its neglect of analyzing anything that's serious. So the Europeans today, who are a well-educated people, are totally in the dark about where they are. They don't know who's governing them. They don't know what the situation is in the US, where it shifts between Trump and something else every 4 years. And I just wanted to mention this one little thing. We're beginning to hear rumors or little remarks in the background in France about the yellow vests, the gilets jaunes, who actually put together something that resembled the beginnings of a revolutionary movement without its having a revolutionary objective.
Peter, you can argue that the surge of far-right parties is that discontent. The Freedom Party is the biggest party in Austria. The Allianz für Deutschland, the Alliance for Germany, is surging. You have Robert Fico back in power in Slovakia. You have Viktor Orban still in power in Hungary. You have in France the rise of Rassemblement National and basically a hung parliament with a prime minister who comes from arguably the smallest faction in the smallest party in parliament. So the entire, apart from the UK, where Labour won a big majority, although it was a shallow majority, apart from Britain, post-Brexit Britain, which is suddenly the cleanest of the dirtiest shirts on that continent, you're in a mess.
Yeah, but the point I wanted to make is that when you look at the yellow vests, it wasn't a political movement. People could come from the left, from the right, from the middle. It was a kind of general criticism of the status quo, obviously. It was a revolt against a highly privileged and extremely wealthy elite that was running the country, but it wasn't seeking to align with a political program. And that has significance. I'm not claiming to know what that significance is, but I believe that there's a kind of disillusion with all the ideologies, whether it's right, left, Democrat, Republican, Social Democrat, however you want to label it. I think there's something profound happening, which is not being expressed through democratic institutions.
So what you're saying is it's not just the US, the problem is in Europe too. It's the same problem in a different form. It's cancer. Maybe it's not stomach cancer, but maybe it's brain cancer.
Generalized cancer, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. Haruko, does Japan
Well,
suffer from
as a
cancer or
Japanese,
have you avoided it?
no, we've had our populist moment with, a mild one that nobody seemed to think it was populist, but Prime Minister Abe was a very populist. He's not anti-establishment, but he's not necessarily completely right-wing. But if you compare with the populist leaders in Europe, he is very comparable. He's sort of anti-democratic, but we sort of weathered through that, came through relatively, because the people were not interested in being agitated by ideology anymore. That's something about Japan that might be very different from, say, some parts of Europe, where
Or India. India is
well,
very ideological as well in a strange way.
yeah, but what I meant to say is that, so just superficially speaking, if we focus on, say, the issue of immigration, which is both common in the United States and in Europe, America has a way of talking about race because it's a racist society just by the makeup, and so they've had this history of speaking about race.
Yeah.
Europe traditionally doesn't have the vocabulary to address race. They have social class. They can talk about class, but that historically it's just the way that race, in the way that's comparable to the United States, Europe isn't sort of versed in addressing racial issues in a more sort of, well, in a way that the Americans do. So my point is, though, so it's really about the changing demographic sort of composition of society that is affecting all of these liberal democratic Western countries, whereas Japan, for all the accusations that we get about not, getting accepting refugees or being very close to immigration. We don't actually have an immigration policy per se. At least that sort of social, racial, ethnic harmony really didn't come into play except for the ones that we already have. So our right wing has a very different ideological bearing or standing from, say, Europe. But what I meant to say is that where America and Europe is standing, and yes, I can understand that Europe is confused because yes, I also grew up in Europe and I can see that it's a bit of a mess. But one of the other things that the Europeans persistently refuse to do is to actually acknowledge that they've made mistakes. They are incapable. They've done, for example, and no offense to the European Union, but expanding the European Union so quickly when you knew that the economic sort of measurements or even the currency were a bit of a, forced deal. And having these sort of bars to join the European Union, as you have to be democratic, you have to be this and then the other. It was, as Peter, you're right about this European identity. You can't have it emerging when Europe itself hasn't even acknowledged that, oh yes, we have the Western Europe and the Eastern Europe and the Middle Europe that traditionally has not, they've not really been, historically speaking, sort of even separate Christian sort of denominations and kingdoms. So this grand project was sort of,
Well, I think, I think there's
sitting
a,
on.
you're absolutely right. I think the reason Europe has managed to grow extremely chaotically and without any real sense of a cultural and political objective is that Europeans, knowing who they are, knowing that they actually were the group of people or the ethnicity that spawned the US and created the conditions in which the US could become the dominant power in the world, that they had to work out a way of reassuring themselves that they still had a central place in global history. Because the Europeans want to continue to believe that they were at the start of everything, that civilization is a European creation.
I mean, remember
Well, that's
what
over.
Joseph Borrell said. Remember what Joseph Borrell said. Europe is a garden while the rest of the world is a jungle.
That's right. And
That's
that was an amazing amazing metaphor, if you like, because in saying that, he was saying that even the US was a jungle. Because he was talking specifically about Europe. It wasn't the West, but what he was really referring to was the West, the rules-based order. But he also excluded the US, and I thought that was appropriate, that the US is part of the jungle as well. But Europeans, there's a psychological pressure on European leaders and even Europeans in a certain sense to feel that they need to have something that tells the world that they are a civilization, that and they are the essential civilization. I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're Norwegian, French, Spanish, or Greek. Leonardo da Vinci is one of your heroes. He was
Yes,
Italian.
but Peter, to be fair, and this is where I do believe Marine Le Pen and Nigel Farage and the populists in Europe do have a point. This is an elite project because forget the differences between Western and Eastern Europe. Look at the differences between Northern and Southern Europe. Who's going to bail out Italy? Italy's debt is not payable. Tomorrow, the fat lady will sing.
Neither is Francis. So.
Neither, yeah, exactly. So what happens then? Will German taxpayers bail out Italy? I mean, they did bail out Greece, and they imposed very harsh conditions on Greece instead of doing a haircut. So the EU came up with the euro, and countries basically did creative accounting, which basically means they cooked the books. And of course, Goldman Sachs was involved, and so were some others. And Italy lied, Greece lied, and they got in and they said, well, our accounts are all okay. Everything is fine. Mamma mia, we'll come in. We'll be good boys after this. Everything will be wonderful. And guess what? The Italians will be Italians.
Italy was so pro-Europe because I remember this from the 90s because they couldn't govern themselves. They were sort of Berlusconi was coming up, the countries are divided. You have the the South and North-South problem, and then they realized that the European Union, if we are good students, then they will govern us. That was Italy's sort of bailout plan.
To be fair, a lot of countries were fleeing national nightmare into the and coming buying in. Sorry, I'll rephrase this. A lot of countries were fleeing their national nightmares to buy into the American dream. The Spanish were fleeing Franco. The Greeks were fleeing relative insignificance of 2 millennia. The Italians were fleeing their division and dysfunction. The Poles were fleeing Katyn Forest, wherein the Soviets just slaughtered the flower of their society. So, in many ways, the EU was this extraordinary dream which allowed the Europeans to feel internationally relevant, as Peter said. Also, the Europeans felt if we could create promised land and a superpower in North America, we could go all the way there and do it. Why can't we do it here at home after we banish war and national rivalries to the dustbin of history? And so the European idea was in some ways yet another vision of a unified Christendom. And that's where, to be fair, the both the French Jacques Delors and Giscard d'Estaing, they were both devout Catholics. So in some ways, it was a new form of Catholicism to unite Europe.
That's probably why they can't handle Muslims.
Yeah, and they cannot handle their own Protestants like Nigel Farage, the new Martin Luthers.
Well, at least Europe, I mean, at least the UK anyway. The UK I grew up was a lot more secular. I mean, yes, you have the Anglican Church and so on and so forth, and it is part of, the Constitution of, the United Kingdom. But compared to the US, and this is me going, shifting from a boarding school in the UK to a college in the US, I had no idea the US was so religious, so Christian. And this, I think, is slightly what marks the difference between where Europe is now, just generally speaking, and where the American, say, social or political dialogue is having difficulties, because you have many believers of different things. But there is a sizable people driven by certain religiosity, whether it's the Second Amendment, whether it's evangelism, whatever it is. But that is not the case in Japan, certainly not the case in Japan, but that isn't really the case, at least, in average part of Europe.
It's a very complex question, religiosity in the US, but because everyone has the right to believe anything.
Exactly.
It's not the right to join a church, it's the right to believe anything. So you could be a flat earther, which is a kind of religion as well. But because that right is absolute, I mean, it's probably the only absolute right people recognize, because now the First Amendment is no longer considered an absolute right, especially by Democrats, because you can censure anyone who says something that is not politically correct. The one thing everyone has the right to do is just to believe in nonsense. So not all nonsense is nonsense. There are some very extraordinary ideas that happen to be true. But if you consider that all ideas are equal and that everyone has the right to believe in anything they want to believe in, and then they can group together. They do group together in churches traditionally, and Americans have always thought of the church as the place where the community regathered every Sunday.
Mm.
So it wasn't so much what the doctrines of the church were. It was there. That's where the community is actually got together and talked to each other. They didn't necessarily listen to the sermons, but they did get together and say, we're part of the same group. But then when you got to the point where people could disagree about fundamental things, and racism was actually, the whole racial question in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s, became the point on which people could say, I believe in one thing or another, or I believe in one set of laws, or one set of rules rather than laws. Then you could start believing in anything you wanted. We didn't have, I don't think, when I grew up in the 50s, I don't think we had flat earthers. Or if we did, there may have, I think actually that kind of existed, but it was just something you laughed at. But now people actually write articles about flat earthers and their beliefs. But
I think that is also, Peter, to cut you short, that is also the feature of the internet. Now you have the internet, every crazy voice is amplified, and you have social media with its filter bubbles and echo chambers. So it's not just, to be fair, it's just not just the US that's happened worldwide. I mean, there are Indians who
no,
believe
but
that.
in the US, you have the axiom that everyone has the right to believe whatever they want, and that social norms do not even limit what you can believe in. In most societies, in Europe as in Japan, there's a notion of social norms. Even if you believe in something, you won't talk about it in public because society, it's not that they're intolerant, it's that society has imposed sets of behavior and a kind of decorum that people respect because they know that that's the condition on which you can interact with other people. In the US, there's this notion that if I believe it, it must be true. I have the same right to impose it as the truth as the next person, or as the next party, or as the next church. Oops. Or as anything else that people believe in.
And is this right now amplified after Donald Trump's election?
Absolutely. It just keeps getting more amplified. And as you said, social media was a factor in its extreme amplification. At the same time, I think that there's a growing doubt about any group of extreme beliefs, including the extreme beliefs of an established political party. We're starting to see, well, this is perhaps just an impression I have, is that we're starting to see more independent reporting, thanks to Substack, mainly, because that's a platform on which people who drift away from, I'm talking about professionals who drift away from the established institutions they work for, especially the press. So you have people from the New York Times, people from The Intercept. There's been a vast movement of people away from The Intercept, which initially was not an establishment outlet, but actually turned into something of an establishment outlet. And now you've got Ryan Grimm, Ken
Peter, we are
Clifton.
getting lost in the weeds. I mean, that's not something we can, I mean, that's not germane to the
No, but
discussion in a way.
what I'm
Yeah,
saying is,
sure. I mean, that's a trend. They are going to Substack, but Substack could go broke tomorrow. Before
but I'm not
Substack, there was before Substack, they had another platform. I'm even forgetting which, a big one, which, so,
you've got Rumble,
that
you've got
that's not the point. The
the-
point is fine, this election, this is happening in the US, but what is the what is its effect on America, sorry, on Europe and through European eyes? Uh, what do you, how do you see the USA unfolding and B impacting Europe? Because in some ways, Yanis Varoufakis and many others have called Europe now a new colony of America. They talk about techno-feudalism. Everything you use is American. You have no uh, big company you've come up with in the last 40, 50 years. And the Mario Draghi report, which is nearly 400 pages, is very candid about the lack of European competitiveness, including the drop in productivity.
Yes, well, that's because Europe accepted a subservient position so long as there was a reasonable amount of transfer of consumer products and possibilities for niche areas of the economy for Europeans, such as luxury goods for the French.
For France, yeah.
And I mean, there has been, all these bureaucrats have studied the ways in which you could have a number of stable sectors of the economy working through Europe at the same time as being dominated by whatever was happening in the US at the highest level, especially in technology. Now, I think what you're saying is absolutely right, that the shock, I mean, there's a double shock. The shock at realizing what the Biden administration has done to Europe, as you explained earlier, is one thing. And now the shock that Trump will probably move in the same direction and even worse.
He'll double down.
He'll double down. Europeans are now having to take stock of where they are, but they are incapable of doing it because they don't have a unified political structure, and they don't, even at the national level, they don't have stable political platforms to work from. So it's a state of general confusion. Now,
Oh Lord, you're painting a picture of decline and decay.
No, of chaos. And you know, the good thing about chaos is that it's not that it forces something to happen. This is a general principle of the universe. Chaos induces order, some kind of order. There's some kind of general principle in the universe that says
you've been spending too much time in India.
But which is all to say that I'm not in a position to predict anything, and I don't think there is anyone who is in a position to predict anything. But we know that something will happen, generally through crisis. So it's not
okay.
A decline. It
let's
could be
move to Haruko. She's been very quiet. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we'll wrap this up. Pardon me?
My message to Europe, and not to Peter per se, but Europe, and if what Peter is describing about the European state of mind, and I would say sort of certain parts of Europe, don't think is true, in that they don't know what to do. They're in a state of panic. They're sort of like, oh my goodness, existential, sort of finally discovering that they've been sort of, you know, growing into this American, I wouldn't say colony, but a vassal state or whatever it is. That's like really childish rambling. It's honestly, it's like, it's your problem. The Ukraine war is your problem.
Yeah.
Gaza is your problem. These are partly legacies of World War I, World War II, colonialism, and you know, the British and the French can take, you know, equal responsibility for the Sykes-Picot or the Balfour Declaration. The point is, it is very much not so much of the political system, but I think about the complete letdown of European intellectuals
Yeah.
Their smugness in not seeing what was happening in even in dealing with China, right? When China was beginning to sort of exert real influence, you know, sort of giving them the low-hanging fruit of the BRI and so on and so forth, biting into it, thinking, oh, we can control China. So that's, in a way, the intellectuals have really not been looking hard at some of the real problems. And so, yeah, Atul's probably right. It's a very elite project. And I'm very, you know, I'm sad to see that you have all these resources, talents, you have a, you know, a relatively, developed, very good infrastructure. All of these things are there. And it's like, you, it's a very luxurious problem to have to compare to a lot of other parts of the world. So that's my
No, you're absolutely right.
Right. I mean, let's very quickly, talk about. We haven't even mentioned how Latin America views the election, or Africa. Not that even any of us is from there, but in Latin America, there is some concern, but it again depends. It's a lot of the populists on the right have taken inspiration from it. Argentina's President Milei is flying in to meet Donald Trump. So it's very interesting what you see. Africa, of course, is caught in its own conflicts and economic challenges, particularly post-COVID. In Africa, most people simply don't care what happens elsewhere anymore. In fact, one of the um, less covered things that has happened in Africa is how the Russians have replaced the French in Francophone Afrique. The French have been booted out completely, but pretty significantly.
I was listening to some African experts just the other day who were insisting that they see this as an opportunity for Africa to claim agency, which has been denied up until now. Africa was, whether it was the Americans, the Chinese, or the Russians, or the Europeans in the originally. Africa has always been treated as a place with no agency, and that was simply dependent upon the initiatives that more civilized places were going to bring to it. And now there is a awareness, apparently, in the political class that it's an opportunity to.
Maybe. I'm very doubtful, because the African political class is parasitic. It buys homes in Paris. There's the street of thieves. And even as you speak, maybe something will come out of this period.
Well, I think
maybe agency.
There's an awareness
Maybe.
precisely of that.
Maybe, but we will have to get through a lot of conflict. Much of Africa is in conflict. You look at the Horn of Africa, where we have a fantastic podcast with Martin Plaut as to how the different, nationalities and even subnationalities are all jostling against each other in the Horn of Africa. So in Africa, who knows? In the Middle East, and we haven't touched upon it, there's a big risk. There's a real fear that this could lead to a conflagration. And Mohammed bin Salman has declared Saudi Arabia's support for Palestine. He's come out against Israel. And this is quite significant, because so far the Gulf monarchies had stayed quiet. They had very close relationships with Israel. But ultimately, a lot of these Arab monarchies and Arab elites fear a second Arab uprising, and they fear that the division between the Arab Street, which is very pro-Gaza, which is very pro-Lebanon, very pro-Hezbollah, even very pro-Hamas as well, it could turn against them, and they could be turfed out of their gilded palaces. So the uncertainty there would be how much of a carte blanche will Donald Trump give? Maybe there'll be peace. Some are hoping he's a strong man and he'll be able to tell Bibi what to do, which Joe Biden couldn't. He was too weak in an election year. He wanted both the Jewish vote and the Arab vote, and he got neither. As Joseph Olmert said in an interview with me, he said that, look, the Democrats will have to realize that if they want Arab votes in Detroit, they may lose Jewish votes in Philadelphia. So that was quite fascinating, speaking to him. But the point is, the Middle East, we will see what happens. And I believe the country that has most to fear, and indeed that is quite concerned right now, is China, because there are a lot of China hawks coming into the new administration. There is a real belief that you can bring tariffs. And remember, tariffs were the first thing a newly independent America imposed to industrialize. And those tariffs did help because they created industry for America. Otherwise, America could have been like Latin America, exporting commodities to Europe, especially England, and importing finished goods. Instead, America stole industrial secrets, put up tariffs, protected infant industry, and became an industrial power. And a lot of the economic thinking in the new administration is we can break the back of China where the real estate bubble has burst. And in any case, in the past, America has given Japan, and we can go back to the Plaza Accords, Haruko, and you can educate everyone. America did kill the semiconductor industry in Japan once upon a time. And America, a lot of Americans believe that China is breakable and they want to break China. Over to you, Haruko, because you are sitting in Asia.
There aren't many other people in the world who believe that. But the worst for Trump is that Wall Street doesn't believe it. Wall Street will resist his attempts to decouple China. Now, I don't know how they'll do it, how this will play out. But Trump may have some policies that he's ready to announce and which please his electorate. It's not certain that he can simply impose
Peter,
them.
you forget that Standard & Poor's is now dominated by internet giants. Increasingly, Wall Street's investments have shifted away from China. So the bulk of the S&P
It's not a question
is not
of
really...
But China is a market as well as an industrial base for a lot of.
It's more of an industrial base. It's not as big a market. The Chinese don't consume as much, and consumption has dropped. But over to Haruko, since she's sitting in sitting in Asia.
Well, I don't think it's that simple.
Exactly.
And so if we're going to bring the European analogy here into Asia, one of the things that I think this is shared probably by Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Australia even, is how the China factor in Trump's sort of new whatever policy he's going to introduce. But the thing is, Biden was not great either. Biden actually got a lot of us worried that there's strong rhetoric or this this whole decoupling and so on and so forth was actually going to push China and also the sort of the rebooting of Quad. All of these things were sending a signal to China without Americans sort of trying to explain it, that they would really feel that America's trying to encircle China. And this rhetoric didn't help. So we continue to worry here about US-China relations, if they are going to be managed in a grown-up way, or is it going to sort of escalate one part, the rhetoric, And then as the semiconductors moves around, semiconductors have shown that America is going to sort of relaunch their own sort of industrial policy. And as Atul suggests, to, you know, kind of dismantle or not dismantle, but damage China's sort of industrial power. But I don't think it's all that simple. The point is that as we are worried about what the United States would do, it doesn't mean that we don't know. It's not about like we don't know which way to align, but it's just that all of these countries will, you know, sort of try and balance the 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 sort of cost of what might come with Trump, and also the risks that it might incur on China, because we're all much, much more dependent on as trading partners and economic or industrial cooperation partners with China than, for example, any of the European countries are with China. So in our situation, it's really about, can you just not do anything that really might disrupt all the other stakeholders balancing sort of act between the US and China? So yes, the money flow is one thing, but at the same time, and yeah, you know, Atul just reminded us about what Americans did to Japan. And believe me, Japan has a memory too of it. And so they will know that perhaps we actually have a better sort of understanding of the implications, because the Chinese pattern of that collapsed real estate bubble, it follows Japan's pattern as well, but it's done in a much shorter span of time. And we all know the impact, and you know, China's 10 times bigger than us. So the worry is tangible and real. So what I would really wish for is caution about a lot of the rhetoric
Absolutely.
that would drive up rivalry when it can be avoided. Does that make too idealistic? But
No, it makes you hopeful. I don't know that caution is going to be the buzzword of this new administration. I don't think the people coming in are particularly going to care too much about Asia. In fact, they may struggle to find certain countries on the map. And even in the previous administration, I'm sure many would have struggled on the map. It isn't, the previous administration pretended to be worldly, but frankly, they weren't. So the reality is that the American working class was the big loser in the period of globalization, and the American elite never compensated it. And so now, Trump has come up with a solution, which is, look, we make in America again, we make America great again. You have J.D. Vance, who became the vice presidential candidate because it was more red meat to your core supporters. And Trump will have to deliver something, whether it is subsidies to industries, whether it is tariffs in selected sectors, whatever they need in Ohio or wherever else. All of that will happen. Now, will it end up in carols and bonfires and great parties? We don't know. Will it end up in smoke? Seems more likely, because the nimble footing you need to transition to a new economy is difficult for any policymaker. And no major tectonic economic shift happens without pain. So my gut feeling is, yes, the stock market may go up. Yes, things may be hunky-dory for a while. But afterwards, the balloon will burst, the bubble will burst. There's no way you can keep this party going for too long.
What's Trump going to do about the $36 trillion debt?
Everyone has debt, by the way, and that
Yeah,
is
exactly.
global debt. Global debt is way too high, and there'll be a reckoning. That's it.
Yeah, exactly. And it only has to start in one place for it to spread across the globe.
I
Yeah,
think
but
economic
Peter,
management.
you live in Southwest France. You can drink wine and
Oh,
cognac and be happy.
yes, we'll have all the wine we need.
Well, let's see if Boeing can get their act together and start making planes that actually don't have a screw loose. That would be a sign of American industrial sort of power coming back. You can't have doors falling.
Now, that is true, but folks in the Biden administration point out that industry has come roaring back in the US, and it has to some degree. There are lots of jobs in industries. There are new industries when it comes to polymers, new materials. It's easy quite often to think of decline or rise as inevitable and inexorable, but everything goes in cycles in most economies.
Yeah. I
So
mean,
people were too busy to write, I mean, too quick to write Japan off. Japan retains great strengths, and the Japanese economy is resilient in many ways. Of course, it has risks. The public debt is too high. And similarly, America, with its entrepreneurial energy and powerful universities, has resilience and innovation. And it won't be what one of Trump's Indian supporters, I believe it was a venture capitalist or someone who said there'll be a sonic boom of industrialization or something to that effect. I don't think it'll be that, but America is already, and for the last few years and right from the Obama years, doing quite well in new forms of industry. And remember, robotics, uh, the mass adoption of robotics means that the labor cost arbitrage that
And AI.
other countries held don't hold to the same
But,
degree as
but,
earlier.
but robotics and AI mean less employment. So it's a
True.
different kind of industrialization.
Yes,
At the
yes.
same time, the working class in the US, to the extent that there was a working class, which was the case up
Yeah.
until about 1970, 80, has lost its working class culture and its working class identity. And that you need and that's why immigrants have actually filled in the gap. So now you want to stop immigration and expect that the working class is going to re-identify. I mean, the people we call working class, which is really lower middle class, that we're going to expect them to come back to the kind of working class mentality, which is I'm part of a larger team that's producing something. My manual skills are a contribution to the strength of the country. It's no longer manual skills. It'll be people running their own AIs and controlling what their AIs and their robots are doing.
No, I mean, this is the AI thing is over-egged, but to give a practical example, if one of the things an admiral in America told me that the biggest national security threat in his view was the lack of welders. And remember, welding has got very technical now, the temperatures, the materials, etc. So, the US will have to adapt. And Peter, for all its faults, the community college system and the just get up and go in America is extraordinary. It's extraordinary. People do fix up their own homes in a way Indians wouldn't. Indians would just,
Oh, absolutely.
have a learned helplessness, and
Yeah.
so do people from former colonies. So I wouldn't underestimate American dynamism. Yes, there are massive problems too. Haruko is trying to say something.
I think just one thing. So I just, Peter just reminded me. So in every other country that I've worked in, apart from the United States, so in the UK, Italy, or Japan, there is a discourse about industrial, sort of structural industrial change, and that we all move to this somewhat of a post-industrial society where the manufacturing, what we manufacture change. For example, all of these countries shut down coal mines, went through a huge movement about, these were serious like disruptions and so on. And so that is perhaps the story that America doesn't really talk in that way. Of course, the workers' union, the steel makers and the car makers and so on, they have unions, and they talk about it in union language. But the point is, as a country as a whole, every country goes through some structural change of the types of industries they have. So I was just thinking that perhaps one way of looking at what's going on in the United States, whether it's is precisely that, and that transition is going to be painful, is going to have political and social disruptions. And once it's sort of reaches a certain, I don't know, equilibrium point, a new equilibrium, perhaps the politics would stabilize. But I do see that, we do need to factor in that from, making everything, to be able to make everything from doing really high stakes tech stuff and building airplanes. America makes a lot of things, but at the same time, some of the core industries like automobiles, um, they've just not had the comeback that Americans expected.
But Haruko, you could argue that yes, Detroit hasn't, but someone dropped me off in a Tesla. Tesla
No, no,
has,
no,
and
no.
Tesla
What
is
I mean,
selling everywhere.
yeah. So what I mean is that, but these are transitions, right? So from
Yes.
Detroit, whatever. I mean, Boeing's moving their factory, some of the factories to, where is it? Somewhere in South Carolina, from Seattle. Apparently that factory is a bit of a disaster.
That's one way of hiding the shame.
But so, you have even these big companies restructuring and doing things that also contributed to some of these disruptions. So I agree that the working class has lost their identity, but also I think that working class itself is it's not, I don't think it's the identity. It's really about that sort of
It's a
job
mission.
match transition.
Yeah. You always have to, I mean, as a class, I mean, this is, I think, true sociologically. You have
There you go, theorizing like a good Frenchman.
well, no, I think there's a sense of what you as a class have as a mission in society, the whole group of people you belong to.
Well, I come from a country where you have caste, not class.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. No, but I think this is a serious problem psychologically and politically. Psychologically, because you have to create a new set of conditions that people will adhere to and see the benefit for themselves of adhering to. But then you also need a leader who can do that. That's why you could ask the question: is Trump the kind of leader, let's say, that FDR was? FDR made actually pretty much a mess of the economy during the 30s, and it was the war effort that got the U.S. out of the doldrums. But he provided the kind of leadership that gave a working class identity to the U.S. and enabled them to become
I don't
American.
know. I don't know if I concur with that he made a mess. I mean, at that time, things were difficult, and he did try some things that worked and some things that didn't. Everyone was
He
experimenting
didn't make the
because the
mess,
depression.
but he didn't solve the mess.
Sure, yeah.
He did solve it in a certain sense psychologically, because he got people on board with the idea that they could work together and get something accomplished.
No,
And it
I
was
mean, he did
had
certain
the
things like
challenge of secondary
Glass-Steagall.
reform.
He he did things like Glass-Steagall
Absolutely.
that only Bill Clinton repealed, or rather he went along with it. The Congress repealed it and came up with a new act. But to say that he made a mess, yeah,
No,
that is. I never knew you were turning Republican.
No, it's not a question. I'm not a Republican. I'm not.
I think so. This is not about political leadership in that sense. I don't think. It's really, number one, what really stands out about American corporate culture is the obscenity of the salary of the CEOs and the management and the workers. This is obscene.
Yeah.
So there is something to do with Wall Street capitalism, neoliberalism, however you want to call it. So as a businessman, Donald Trump should not be in a position to be dictating "Make America Great Again" unless he is willing to tax these obscene corporations.
Yeah.
But he's not. So, but I think that is something that it's a corporate culture thing, and America's private enterprises, it's a very, very much more powerful than anywhere else in the world. So with some tax incentives, with some renewed, I don't know, enthusiasm, perhaps the way the American capitalism works might change. And if that changes, and also I know that even with these Paris agreements and Kyoto Protocol, it doesn't have to be the federal government. States can join and stay on it. That's the beauty of the federal union. But I think there's a lot of, resources, a lot of drawers where there are ways of, if not mitigating, but at least riding through these perhaps chaotic 4 years without feeling everything, sort of blaming.
You're assuming that when you say these chaotic 4 years, that the following 4 years will be less chaotic.
No, I'm not.
Okay.
Oh no. Oh no, I have no hope in America becoming, as Biden said, a normal state in the next 20 years.
Yeah.
No.
Exactly.
On that note, on that merry note, the view from Japan, Osaka, is that America will not become a normal state in the next 20 years. The view from France is we are confused about ourselves, and we are even more confused about America. And we are so obsessed with America that we will pontificate about it endlessly. The view from India is let's make a deal. You give me good deal, I give you a good deal. And our judgment collectively is that we are in a period of profound social, economic, and political tectonic shifts. And we'll go through a period of pain before things stabilize to a new reality. So from all of us here, from all of us at Fair Observer, it's bye for now. Keep subscribing to our YouTube channel. Make sure that you get your friends to do so too. Sign up for our newsletter. We have launched a campaign to reach 1,001 recurring donors, and the bar is set as low as $11 a year, which is less than $1 a month, which is nothing, which is far less than minimum wage. So if you support free, fair, and independent media, then back us. Make sense of the world. Bye for now.
Thank you, Atul.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.